January 1945. The snow over Auschwitz lay thick, muting the echoes of a war already lost for those inside and those who built it. Behind the main camp's electrified fences, beyond the crematoria smoke, stood a row of small, windowless barracks fenced off from the rest, silent, guarded, and off-limits even to the SS themselves. Inside them, twin children slept on straw mats, their arms tagged with matching numbers drawn in ink. When Soviet troops liberated the camp weeks later, they found something far stranger than any battlefield intelligence. In those hidden barracks lay hundreds of detailed notebooks, trays of preserved organs, and photographs labeled with twin codes, A1147 and A1148. The documents described injections, transfusions, and measurements performed in surgical precision on pairs of children. Many of the names matched none in the registry, only initials, written in handwriting that survivors would later recognize as belonging to Dr. Josef Mengele. 2 months later, in Frankfurt, Allied medical officers sorted the evidence in disbelief. Among the confiscated material were entire binders labeled Zwillingsforschung, twin research. The diagrams showed skull cross-sections, ocular pigmentation charts, and side-by-side photographs of children taken days apart, some smiling, some visibly broken. One American officer noted, "The hand that wrote these notes wrote with affection and with calculation, an inconceivable contradiction." At first, intelligence analysts assumed they were looking at meaningless pseudoscientific propaganda. The Reich had already produced countless documents justifying racial hygiene, but as U.S. pathologists examined the samples recovered from the camp, glass jars sealed with wax and marked Set A and Set B, it became clear these were not theoretical studies. They were data sets, the results of systematic experiments conducted on living children. Among the records was a letter draft addressed to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. It described new techniques for comparative immunology using twins as biological constants. Mengele promised the Institute that his ongoing work would define the limits of racial purity through heredity. The Americans understood at once that this was no isolated cruelty. It was a research program. In April 1945, as Allied teams gathered evidence for future war crime trials, the twin files shocked even hardened investigators. They found logs of approximately 700 twin pairs used during the war, most of them children between 6 and 12 years old. Fewer than 200 were found alive. Every surviving subject described the same pattern: daily measurements of eyes, limbs, and organs under the illusion of medical care, followed by injections, dissections, or death. Reports from those few survivors would later testify that the noise of drills and saws came most often at night, after lights out, from the barracks behind the camp hospital. That was where the twins were taken for what Mengele called the real work. Among them were siblings who remembered each other's screams as data was recorded. One American doctor wrote in his report, "It is not the science that horrifies, it is the purpose." When this evidence reached Nuremberg months later, the German defendants could hardly comprehend how the Allies had pieced so much together. Joseph Kramer, former commandant of Bergen-Belsen and witness to Mengele's transfers, muttered during questioning, "Those were private research matters, not military crimes." But the files on the interrogation table, American intelligence photographs of the hidden barracks, proved otherwise. The Nazis who had dismissed Allied accusations of barbarism now found themselves confronted by their own handwriting. Laboratory records, initials, typed pages stamped Geheim, secret. It was no longer propaganda. It was proof. For many Allied officers, those reports revealed a depth of planning that rivaled any military operation. The twin program was not improvisation. It was architecture. A cold, deliberate blueprint of cruelty disguised as curiosity. And as they prepared their prosecutions for the coming doctor's trial, something else became clear. The evidence gathered behind those barracks would not just convict individuals, it would redefine science itself. In the spring of 1946, in a quiet medical ward near Munich, a group of children sat on hospital beds under soft white sheets. They were survivors from Auschwitz, twins who had endured what Allied investigators now called the comparative studies. Each pair had been labeled, measured, and cut open in the name of science. Now, under the care of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, they were learning how to speak again, how to walk without fear of the next injection. American journalists described them as ghosts of arithmetic, living proof of an ideology that converted biology into brutality. Despite their fragile health, interrogators gently recorded their words. Some spoke Polish, others Hungarian or Roma dialects, but one phrase appeared in every translation. They said we were lucky to be twins. Among the interrogations preserved, one narrative stood out. A boy named Miklos, age 9, described how Dr. Mengele would visit the twin barracks each morning dressed impeccably. Boots shined, gloves spotless, smile polite. He would greet the children, pat them on the head, promise sweets or extra soup, and then summon pairs to the operating room. Hours later, one of the two was returned, barely conscious or not at all. Mengele's calm voice followed every order, as if orchestrating a symphony of suffering. What stunned Allied investigators most was not how brutal the experiments were, but how thoroughly they had been documented. The so-called children's section at Auschwitz housed hundreds of charts. Blood composition data, reactions to serums, eye color alterations. In several charts, colored ink documented attempts to induce pigmentation changes by injecting dye directly into children's eyes. The surgeons recorded outcomes with the precision of academic researchers and the detachment of accountants. By mid-1946, the U.S. Army's War Crimes Division had compiled a full dossier labeled Evidence Group C-12, Genetic Human Specimen Research, Auschwitz Tissue. The files contained 42 rolls of photographic negatives showing twins before procedures, their faces carefully posed and marked with numbered tags. Some of the photographs were taken after death for autopsy comparison. Those images would later be presented at the Nuremberg doctors' trial as part of the campaign to expose systematic ideology masquerading as medicine. For the German defendants, the revelation was catastrophic. They had expected Allied prosecutors to rely on hearsay. Instead, they produced original materials, logbooks, correspondence, and tissue samples sealed in preserved form. Fritz Fischer, an SS physician associated with Ravensbrück, reportedly shook his head during cross-examination and whispered, "They know everything." During the proceedings, Allied prosecutor Dr. Leo Alexander read aloud from one of the twin notebooks recovered at Auschwitz. The experiment concludes satisfactorily with the death of both subjects. Results recorded in sequence for twin pair 40-40-40-41. He paused before finishing. It is entered as satisfactory because all differences between subjects ceased. The courtroom fell silent. One of the interpreters later recalled hearing German doctors in the audience murmur, "Unglaublich," unbelievable. What truly unnerved them was how the Americans had reconstructed their hidden world. By comparing recovered documents with testimonies, the prosecutors established that the twin program had been part of a broader hierarchy of racial studies sanctioned by Berlin. It wasn't a rogue operation, it was institutional. The defense argued these were scientific necessities, meant to improve Germany's medical future. But photographic evidence of child corpses labeled by experiment type demolished that. Rhetoric. Among the exhibits was a single page that would later become symbolic. It showed two handprints in different colors, one blue, one brown, stamped on notebook paper beside the word Vergleich, comparison. Below, a narrow line in black ink read, "Subjects expired within 24 hours of test completion." The line looked precisely like an entry from a factory ledger, neat and impersonal. When these artifacts were shown to the accused, some turned away. Others stared blankly, trapped between denial and realization, not because the crimes were unknown to them, but because for the first time they understood how completely their science had been unmasked. The illusions of method, progress, and obedience all lay in fragments before the world. By late summer, the evidence of the twin experiments had redefined the prosecution's approach. The Nazis had sought to prove racial hierarchy. The Allies had proven moral annihilation. Behind Auschwitz's barracks, the idea of humanity itself had gone through an experiment, and the results were irreversible. By autumn 1946, the courtroom in Nuremberg had become a museum of horrors disguised as research. Every photograph, every vial, every notebook bore witness to what the Reich called medical progress. But in truth, what the Allies uncovered in those twin archives was not progress. It was prophecy, a warning written in numbers, tissue, and names that no one survived to carry. The tribunal documents show that American forensic analysts spent weeks cataloging the twin experiments under a single chilling phrase: studies in hereditary degeneration control. What began as a project to trace genetic disease had transformed into a pursuit to purify the human race through eugenics. The evidence made it painfully clear what Nazi scientists called discipline was, in reality, desecration wrapped in the language of discovery. Prosecutor Telford Taylor described the moment. The twin studies entered evidence as the day medicine lost its innocence. He explained how Auschwitz had operated not just as an extermination site but as a functioning clinical system, managed with military precision. The camp's medical wing received administrative reports, equipment requisitions, and even performance evaluations that resembled those of university laboratories. The illusion of professionalism had sheltered atrocity. One of the most disturbing exhibits, labeled C12-41, showed two preserved human hearts. They belonged to twin girls aged 10, who had been part of a circulation study meant to prove racial differences in vascular resilience. The notes beside them were signed J.M. The discovery silenced the courtroom. Even the defense counsel chose not to speak. When questioned why children were used, one German doctor replied, "The twins gave the power of comparison." Beyond the courtroom, journalists struggled to describe what they saw. One American correspondent for Life magazine wrote, "Every chart, every sketch, is written in flawless academic German." This was science conducted by men who taught at our same universities, who quoted the same philosophers, but somewhere they began to believe that precision was morality. Inside the trial records lies an overlooked detail: the shock among Nazi witnesses themselves, when Allied experts presented pre-existing American intelligence. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services had already documented fragments of twin research months before Auschwitz was liberated. American reconnaissance teams had found partial archives near Dachau, cross-referencing supply orders and train logs to track shipments of specimens. When the Nazis realized how much the Americans already knew, several defendants reportedly whispered among themselves that the Allies had turned our science against us. That statement proved more accurate than they understood. The same medical knowledge Nazis twisted toward genocide became the foundation for a new global reckoning, a template for what ethical science must never become again. The twin experiments were no longer mere evidence of brutality. They were lessons for civilization, written in the most permanent language imaginable. Pain. Judge Walter Beals, presiding over the doctor's trial, summarized it with haunting precision. The accused call themselves scientists, yet science without a soul is not progress, but the relapse of man into darkness. His words were printed in every major newspaper from Chicago to Geneva, reminding readers that Auschwitz was not built only by ideology, but by intellect devoid of restraint. Among the final witnesses was a Polish nurse, herself once imprisoned at the camp. She testified that Mengele spoke of his experiments not as punishment, but as contribution. He said one day the whole world would thank him. In the gallery, an American medic listening took his notes and wrote in the margin, "The world will thank him for showing us where to draw the line." As the trial concluded, the twin experiments became the turning point of the prosecution, the moment when legal justice merged with moral revelation. These records forced the Allies to confront more than German guilt. They forced them to face scientific hubris itself. When the final sentences were read, the courtroom stood between two ages. the age that believed knowledge justified anything, and the one that would swear it never would again. The ruins of Auschwitz, the notebooks of Mengele, and the tears of the surviving twins together formed not simply evidence, but the boundaries of a new moral world. And in those pages, the West found its reflection, a realization that the pursuit of science, unguarded by conscience, did not lead forward at all. It led back into the abyss. The deeper investigators dug into the twin archives, the clearer it became that these studies were never improvisations of a single madman. They were the result of a bureaucratic machine that converted ideology into laboratory procedure. The Germans had built a system where morality was replaced by management, and nowhere did that system crystallize more than behind the barracks of Auschwitz. The files captured by U.S. forces contained stamps, requisition orders, even material budgets listing the cost of equipment for hereditary comparison analysis. The line items included microscopes, anesthesia syringes, and children's hospital gowns, with tags for specimen classification. American prosecutors described the project as industrialized experimentation. It mirrored the same structure as the Reich's war. Production, assembly lines of flesh instead of steel. There were supervisors, clerks, and chain-of-command memos establishing who approved which procedure. Everything that had once represented efficiency now appeared as the signature of inhumanity. Among the documents seized in Berlin was one chilling letter, dated June 1944, from Mengele's assistant to a senior official in the Race and Settlement Office. It read, "The twin experiments proceed favorably. Mortality remains low, under 20%. Preliminary data suggests the Reich's generational program can advance once standard deviations are stabilized." The letter closed with a list of materials required for continuity: morphine, adhesive bandages, and 24 subjects aged under 12. It was the language of logistics, not medicine. When Allied analysts presented this evidence at the doctor's trial, even hardened Nuremberg veterans were stunned by its formality. The prosecution displayed a flowchart showing how authorization for the twin studies had passed through official channels, approved first by camp administrators, then by the Reich Health Office in Berlin, and finally by the SS Main Medical Bureau. What the world had imagined as isolated madness turned out to be a policy with stationery paper, seals, and signatures. In response, the German defense argued that all major nations had conducted scientific research relating to heredity. They cited pre-war American eugenic studies, desperate to portray Nazi crimes as misguided scholarship rather than evil. But prosecutors countered with evidence showing the decisive difference: intent. American and British medical programs sought prevention. Nazi research sought elimination. The lesson was undeniable. When science serves purification instead of preservation, it ceases to be science at all. Several witnesses who had worked under Mengele testified under oath that they never saw themselves as criminals. One recalled, "We believed we were saving Germany from contamination." Another said, "I only recorded measurements. I thought morality was for politicians." The court reminded them that morality is not a department. It is the axis on which civilization turns. Across the Atlantic, newsreels carried footage from the trial to audiences who had never imagined laboratories could become crime scenes. Viewers saw American officers lifting jars labeled Eyes, Twin Pair 3090. Others showed notebooks where two names were written side by side, with a line drawn through one, simply meaning death. For many civilians, the shock was personal. The revelation that technological and medical brilliance, without restraint, could nullify humanity itself. Meanwhile, medical boards and universities across the United States began quietly re-examining their own wartime research ethics. In the halls of Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the U.S. Surgeon General's office, memorandums circulated citing the moral catastrophe of Nuremberg. The images of twins behind barbed wire forced a reckoning that extended far beyond Germany. Scientists and policymakers alike realized the verdict would not only define Nazi guilt, it would define the boundaries of knowledge itself. When verdicts were finally handed down, The documents describing the twin experiments were used as the cornerstone for a new phrase that would forever change the lexicon of medical research. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. From those words, the Nuremberg Code emerged, not just as a legal principle, but as a safeguard against the dark potential of every laboratory on Earth. In the ashes of the Reich, American officers packed away the evidence into sealed crates labeled confidential human research materials. They understood its danger and its value. Those crates would one day anchor exhibits in Washington, London, and Jerusalem, as humanity's most painful reminder that medicine is not neutral. It bends either toward healing or toward cruelty, depending on who wields it. Even as decades passed, the twin barracks of Auschwitz remained an open wound in the history of science. The American evidence had done more than convict men. It had exposed an entire worldview built on arithmetic and supremacy. It showed that horror does not begin in darkness. It begins in clarity, with someone convinced that suffering can be justified by logic. Behind those barracks, data had replaced empathy. But in Nuremberg, empathy struck back. The world that once measured children like specimens learned to measure itself instead, not by races, but by conscience. When the trials resumed in December 1946, the German public was finally allowed to see fragments of the evidence that had shocked even Allied judges. Newspapers printed restrained summaries under headlines like "Medical Science on Trial." The photographs, children paired like specimens, labeled with numbers and color codes, spread through ruined cities, where most citizens still refused to believe what had been done in their name. But the most electrifying moment came when prosecutors unveiled proof that documents describing the twin experiments had passed through government ministries in Berlin, stamped with official approvals. It destroyed the myth that Auschwitz was the isolated madness of a few men. The state itself had funded and archived the results. Interrogations of captured Nazi doctors revealed a pattern of moral blindness disguised as patriotism. One stated he had never considered the children as human in the conventional sense. Another said he believed they were part of necessary wartime biology. Their testimonies proved that genocide had not been powered by hate alone. It had been driven by the seduction of method. For the Americans attending the trial, one irony lingered. The very precision that made the German medical establishment world famous had also made its crimes undeniable. Lists, charts, detailed protocols, every attempt at perfection became its own confession. In a secret annex of the courthouse, U.S. investigators cataloged miles of paperwork seized from research centers across occupied Germany. Among them was a sealed courier folder marked Forschungsergebnisse, Twins Study, Confidential. It contained half-burnt letters to and from Mengele's mentor, Professor Ottmar von Verschuer, a respected geneticist who had guided the moral collapse of an entire discipline. In one letter from 1943, von Verschuer thanked Mengele for valuable specimens and promised recognition upon the next advancement of eugenic law. The American press later called this exchange the correspondence that damned a century. It revealed how intellectual arrogance had joined political fanaticism to create atrocity with administrative efficiency. After the reading of these letters, the defense strategy crumbled. The accused realized they were no longer merely fighting for freedom. They were fighting to reclaim the meaning of their profession. The German delegation of medical observers wrote a private memorandum admitting that the scientific conscience of Europe will now forever pass through Nuremberg. Outside the courtroom, the U.S. Army photographers captured the expressions of the accused as prosecutors displayed the copybooks from behind the twin barracks. Each page bore child's handwriting, names, dates, sometimes tiny drawings of flowers or animals. It was the only surviving trace of their individuality in a program that had tried to reduce them to control variables. For a brief moment, even those who had dismissed guilt as propaganda fell silent. What rattled the Nazi defendants most was the realization that their secret program had not ended with defeat. It had been exhumed and immortalized. The Americans, by preserving every document, had ensured that the twin studies would live forever as evidence of what happens when logic divorces itself from empathy. What had been designed as evidence of superiority instead became the proof of civilization's lowest point. And in Berlin, far from the trials, intellectuals and students began confronting the unthinkable. Pamphlets circulated among universities, titled Science and Responsibility, quoting the newly translated lines of the developing Nuremberg Code. One young medic at the University of Heidelberg wrote in his journal, "We have learned that medicine can commit murder when it forgets why it exists." By August 1947, the Nuremberg doctors' trial concluded with a final declaration that would define moral science for generations: the Nuremberg Code. 10 sentences carved out of horror, written to ensure that the age of the twin experiments would never return. Each principle was simple: voluntary consent, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, discontinuation if harm was likely, rules that seemed obvious, yet billions had to die for the world to realize they were not. The Americans who authored the code, Dr. Leo Alexander and Dr. Andrew Ivy, drew directly from the twin case reports. They used the images and testimonies of young survivors to argue that no science could claim innocence when built upon coercion. In one of his drafts, Alexander wrote, "Every scientist must carry within him the responsibility of conscience, else he is a soldier without a nation." When the code was read aloud for the first time in courtroom 600 of Nuremberg, the surviving twins were already scattered across displaced persons camps. A Red Cross nurse later said, "They were too young to know they had changed the world, yet their suffering had become the foundation of a global moral law." But outside Nuremberg, the lessons were uneasy. Many Allied laboratories continued research practices skirting voluntariness, hiding behind semantics like field testing or operational necessity. Within a decade, the new superpowers were conducting radiation and psychological experiments that raised the same questions anew. It became clear the code was not a cure. It was a warning. Still, its power endured. When the first Israeli prosecutors prepared to try Adolf Eichmann in 1961, they cited the Nuremberg Code as proof that the world already knew right from wrong. During later debates on cloning and genetic engineering, ethicists invoked the twins of Auschwitz as the ultimate cautionary tale: how the pursuit of human perfection leads inevitably to its opposite. Historians note that even Josef Mengele, who escaped capture and lived under false names in South America, could not escape the shadow he left. He died in exile in 1979, still believing himself a scientist, but history had already sentenced him in absentia, not as a doctor, but as a symbol of what science becomes when stripped of virtue. In the decades that followed, the phrase "born of Nuremberg" entered academic vocabulary. Medical schools worldwide began requiring courses in ethics derived from those 10 principles. The image of Auschwitz's twin barracks became part of the collective conscience of humanity. The questions raised there about permission, pain, and power would echo in every new laboratory, every frontier of biology. In a sense, the twin children of Auschwitz became the guardians of modern science. They lived on not as victims, but as the proof that ignorance cannot be claimed once knowledge exists. The code that their suffering inspired became the line between human and inhuman, between discovery and desecration. As late as the 21st century, when scientists edit genes, simulate consciousness, or clone tissue, they do so beneath the same invisible shadow. Behind every sterile instrument lies the memory of a scalpel used without mercy. Behind each consent formed the echo of a number tattooed on a child's arm. That is why, when historians call the Nuremberg Code civilization's moral treaty, they are not exaggerating. It is the only document that reminds humanity that intellect alone does not guarantee enlightenment. It demands that we remember what the Nazis forgot: that science, like power, is only noble when it serves life. The Nazis once imagined their twin project would prove superiority. Instead, it proved that compassion is more powerful than knowledge, and that even in the darkest corner of a death camp, truth could survive long enough to rewrite the laws of humanity. When the Nuremberg verdicts were announced, reporters noted that the defendants looked not angry, but hollow, men who finally understood that civilization had rejected the very moral foundation they once believed unshakable. The images of the twin experiments displayed before the world became more than court evidence. They became the boundary markers of human decency. As 19 doctors and administrators received their sentences, the court declared the twin files the definitive evidence of science without conscience. To the Allied prosecutors, that phrase meant victory. To the world scientists reading about it in the newspapers, it meant warning. The revelation that children had been dissected to measure differences in race shattered the illusion of German superiority forever. What had been described as eugenic perfection proved instead to be intellectual decay. Like the shattered ruins of Berlin, the medical empire of the Reich lay stripped of its glamour, exposing the inhuman calculus beneath. Yet amid the rubble, something extraordinary emerged. The same evidence that had once condemned humanity's cruelty became the blueprint for its redemption. The twin experiments forced the creation of a framework that would define modern ethics. The Nuremberg Code may have been written by Allied judges, but its authors were, in a cruel sense, the victims. The children who suffered behind those barracks had paid the price for the human race to remember what morality meant. Years later, Allied physicians who had recorded the testimonies of the surviving twins often said they felt haunted by one question: why did the world not see it sooner? Reports from occupied Poland had reached London and Washington years before, describing experiments on twins and prisoners, but disbelief had silenced them. That disbelief allowed medicine to become a weapon. Now, with the code at hand, disbelief was no longer possible. Every country, every future lab, would forever stand before the same moral mirror. What the Allies found in Auschwitz was not only the murder of children, it was the murder of mercy. And in that absence, they would build a law to bring mercy back. In the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt, textbooks taught a new lesson: that the pursuit of purity will always destroy what it seeks to perfect. American educators, inspired by Nuremberg, rewrote entire medical curriculums. Every lecture began with the lesson that science serves humanity, never ideology. The twin children of Auschwitz had become ghostly instructors of the modern world. Their faces, preserved in photographs, taught more about right and wrong than any doctrine ever could. The courtroom of Nuremberg has long since fallen silent. The desks where translators once whispered death sentences in multiple languages now stand empty, the microphones unplugged, the flags folded. Yet the echoes of those proceedings reverberate far beyond 1947. They shaped the conscience of everything that followed. Each nation that claimed victory over tyranny walked away with a lesson carved not in stone, but in memory, that intellect, unguarded by empathy, can become as deadly as any weapon invented by man. In the decades after the trials, the evidence from the twin barracks traveled the world. In Washington, crates marked Auschwitz medical files were stored in climate-controlled vaults, too disturbing to exhibit but too valuable to destroy. In England, physicians debating ethics in clinical trials cited them as the case history of humanity's fall from grace. In Israel, surviving twins were interviewed, their stories recorded by sociologists trying to understand how children could carry memories darker than most adults could bear. Each tape began with the same question asked in quiet reverence: "What do you remember of the doctor?" Their answers formed a mosaic of fragments: white gloves, cold light, soft German words that masked steel intentions. The children remembered songs played during procedures, the way he smiled when noting their eye color, the sterile smell of alcohol that meant pain was coming. These fragments outlived the perpetrators. They became the soundtrack to the 20th century's most important moral awakening. The irony history would never forget was this: the Nazis had sought biological proof of superiority. What they gave humanity instead was moral proof of equality. Every chart, every autopsy, every name on those lists told the same story in reverse: that all people bleed the same, All pain is human, all life sacred when stripped of ideology. In universities, generation after generation of doctors began reciting the principle that grew from this realization. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Those 10 words became the invisible guardian of all modern medicine. The Nuremberg Code evolved into the DNA of global ethics. Silently written into laws, medical school oaths, and human rights conventions worldwide. Nobody needed to quote the whole document. Its truth had become instinct, but the ghost of the twin barracks still lingers, an unspoken warning carved into human progress. Each technological breakthrough that blurs boundaries, gene editing, artificial intelligence, the manipulation of life itself, brings humanity back to the same spiritual crossroads where Josef Mengele once stood, believing that purpose justifies cruelty and that discovery excuses arrogance. The Cold War scientists who studied radiation on unsuspecting subjects in the 1950s learned the same thing too late. The Nuremberg Code was not a historical relic. It was a mirror. This mirror reflects every generation that dares to call itself advanced. It demands an answer to a single question. How far is too far? Some answer by remembering the photographs, the children in striped uniforms, the sets of twins holding hands. Others answer by forgetting. The danger lies not in remembrance, but in apathy. To stop looking into the mirror is to risk becoming the reflection. And the reflection is seductive. Unlike battlefields or bombers, it doesn't march or shout. It wears white coats. It speaks softly of progress, of efficiency, of necessity. That is why the story of the twin studies must be told again and again, not to accuse, but to remind that every advance in knowledge divides the world not into strong and weak, but into moral and immoral. In the small Polish town near where Auschwitz once stood, a museum now preserves the floorboards of the original twin barracks. Visitors walk in silence through rooms where only light remains. A single placard bears words left by one of the twins decades later. "We were their experiment. They became our warning." Her handwriting, frail yet steady, captures the paradox of it all. How pain can become wisdom. How survival can become prophecy. And when the snow falls over those ruins, as it did the day the Soviets arrived, it erases tracks and footprints, covering everything but the memory. The world that once dismissed rumors of experiments cannot claim ignorance again. That is the true miracle born from horror. That disbelief transformed into knowledge, and knowledge into conscience. The Americans who uncovered those secret twin studies never knew the full impact of what they had found. They thought they were collecting evidence for justice. In truth, they were preserving the blueprint for humanity's second chance. Because the story of the Nuremberg Code, and of the children who unknowingly authored it, is not simply about history. It is about the cost of forgetting what we have already learned. The barracks are gone, the photographs fade, but the lesson remains immutable. The moment science stops asking whether it should, it becomes what it once tried to end. The Nazis were shocked when they learned that the United States had reconstructed their experiments down to every page, every needle, every name. They saw their own reflection in the eyes of their accusers, and realized too late that history had already written its verdict. The rest of the world must not make the same mistake, because the true legacy of the twin experiments is not death. It is remembrance. The code born from their ashes has outlived every empire that tried to own progress. It speaks through every generation that chooses morality over ambition. And as long as mankind remembers those hidden barracks at Auschwitz, the mirror will remain unbroken, and the choice will remain ours, to repeat or to rise above.